Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. It's very good to see you. Hope you're having a good week. I know that you're very busy with exams. We have our exam on Friday. By now, hopefully, you've seen the review guide that I posted. I posted that on Monday night, just after class. As you can see, it's relatively straightforward, just a list of concepts, some topics for review, and then some readings that we've done already and that presumably you'll just be reviewing. My intention is that if you complete that, you'll be in a good position to complete the exam, not just on time, but effectively, and you'll be in a good position to do well. You undoubtedly have some questions about the review guide. I'm happy to maybe address like some technical questions that might come up, but I do hope that you'll reserve maybe some of the substantive questions for office hours or email, just because we have limited time, and I think that we should do our best to address those questions via other means. Now, with that being said, I know that some questions might have come up. Hargis, do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I know you answered this question before in class, but it kind of slipped my mind. But somebody asked if you were gonna incorporate like the videos that we've watched. Like, do those have like anything to do with the exam? You answered the question, but I just couldn't recall what the answer was.
So we use those videos as examples usually, and they provide a lot of good detail that I can't give you by myself. So you could use those as examples that you refer to in a response. I think that it's fair game, anything that we cover in lecture or any of the material that comes up. So theoretically, you should be ready to answer questions that might relate to that content. But if you look at the review guide closely, you'll notice that it really anchors around just key concepts and analytical perspectives that we've covered in the class. And so if you focus on reviewing the themes in the angles in the ideas and the concepts that we've covered, the big ideas, you'll be in a really good position. And often that does mean rehashing some of those examples, but in general, it means knowing the big stuff. And so the review guide hopefully points you in that direction. And the exam, just to remind you, will be a combination of multiple choice and short answer. It'll be short because it's a short class. 50 minutes is not a lot of time. Still, the best exams and the best approach will involve demonstrating knowledge of the reading as well as a firm grasp of the stuff from class. And so, though we don't often say a great deal about the reading, we do come to class with the expectation that you've completed it and that you're ready to discuss it in any way that we might see fit. So keep studying, keep preparing. Be sure to use all the resources at your disposal, and contact me if you've got questions. Of course, I have office hours too, and I'll be available for drop in during the exam time on Friday. As a reminder, the exam will be in files, and you'll submit it under assignments where there'll be a link for its submission. We'll take it during the regularly scheduled lecture time, and I'll probably post it 10 minutes early because I think it's fair to give you that space, since that might be the time when you begin to come to class, and I want to give you as much time as would be appropriate. So you can count on maybe 50 minutes to an hour, assuming that you get to class on time. All right, everybody. So let's continue discussing ethnicity, race, and voting behavior. The question that I really want to focus on today is, if we accept that race can be a salient predictor of voting behavior, where race is an important cleavage, the question then becomes, well, what does that mean? What does that really mean in practice? Does that mean that elections are just ethnic headcounts and identity is just this kind of uh, thing that informs and influences voting in a very strict sense? Or is it more sophisticated and complicated? And do beliefs about parties shape vote choice? And do beliefs about parties interact with ethnic group membership or evaluations of candidates? Do parties themselves deploy racialized appeals that help to construct images in the heads of voters? And are voters responding to these appeals when they're voting in ways that appear to be ethnic or racialized, if we're to use the term from the reading from this week? These are all really important questions because more generally we want to understand the links between race in voting behavior and ethnicity in voting behavior. Naturally, we want to study cases where race is an important factor for any number of historical or cultural reasons. And in some countries, racial differences are less important. Some countries are more homogenous, like Uruguay, for example, is very homogenous. It's mostly white. Other countries are divided along racial lines, and there's a great deal of diversity. This can impact politics in complicated or relatively simple ways, depending upon your perspective and how we analyze the mechanisms and the links between race and in voting behavior. So what we're going to do today is continue to analyze this question, but by focusing on South Africa. South Africa is an important case, but before we continue, I actually want to step back and I want to ask you, why South Africa? Why not, you know, some other country? What is it about South Africa that makes it a good place to examine the links between race and voting behavior? What can we learn from South Africa? Why is it so important?
I think South Africa's history of being divided for a long time under apartheid between the richer white areas and the uh, poor African areas allow for the demonstration of those divisions to be seen, especially post apartheid when those divisions are no longer in place, but this still the ideas of like racialized communities and sort of having that identity is still very pronounced.
So this is really key. South Africa's history kind of provides us like sort of like a pseudo natural experiment, or at least this useful comparison between the apartheid period and the post apartheid period. And without getting into all the historical detail, apartheid was a period of essentially white rule and in instituted segregation and second class or subordinate status for blacks. In South Africa, that system of domination was highly important. And the end of the apartheid period was a striking departure that signaled an end in the enfranchisement of blacks and, at least in law, the sort of equalization of the relationship between whites and blacks, the institution of a variety of mechanisms of affirmative action, down to places on the national soccer team, just to give you an example. In a variety of ways, the post-apartheid period departed from the apartheid period. And so we can compare those and we can learn, or at least try to determine if race remains salient in the post-apartheid period, despite the end of those formal systems of segregation. In more generally, South Africa is a place where sharp divisions between mostly blacks and whites constitute the core racial cleavage. And so for these reasons, South Africa presents a useful laboratory, so to speak, to investigate the links between race and in voting behavior. And in particular, again, because of the sharp break that came with the end of the apartheid period and the beginning of the democratic all race voting period. I'm gonna shut the door here really quickly. As we discuss the case of South Africa, I want to bring your attention back to this figure that I showed you on Monday and remind you that when we talk about the role of ethnicity or race, it's not so simple as to say ethnicity just determines the vote choice. That might be what you could reduce it down to in its simplest terms, but there's an important role for political parties. In the first place, the salience of ethnicity and race is a big factor. In those countries or societies where racial differences are not pronounced, and where maybe those cleavages themselves are not sharp and pronounced, maybe in those cases it's less important. In cases like South Africa, race and ethnicity is much more salient as a result of the historical legacy of the apartheid period. In the case of the United States, race is very salient as a result of the legacy of slavery and segregation and Jim Crow and a variety of mechanisms of institutionalized white supremacy. These types of factors make for the salience of ethnicity and race, but it also creates a role for political parties to appeal to those racial differences. And, we might call them ethnic parties, either in an implicit sense or in like an explicit sense. For instance, in South Africa, the African National Congress, it's not, a de jure, explicit, formally Black party. It's an all race party, but its constituency is predominantly Black. And in that regard, it's associated with that group. The ANC as a party does appeal to that racial element. It does become a basis for programmatic and political appeals, as we saw in the video on Monday. So the salience of that ethnicity also then creates a role for parties to interact with race and then ultimately shape the vote choice of the individual voter. And so it is a more complicated relationship than simply reducing it to ethnicity and vote choice. Yes, I will post it, Hargis. I was waiting to complete the lecture, but I'll post it during office hours when I make sure that everything else is up to date. So let's begin to take a look at South Africa. The racial makeup of the country exhibits a predominantly Black African component. Almost 81% of the population is Black African. Only about 9% of the population is colored, or that's the term that stems from the apartheid period. In South Africa, it means mixed race or multiple races. So when you see that term in the South African context, it means multiple or mixed race. An even smaller proportion is white, roughly about 8%. And this is a striking fact because you might assume that a larger proportion of the population was white, given that apartheid was the institutionalized supremacy of the white race in South Africa. In fact, it's a tiny minority. And this data shows you then why apartheid itself was such an outrageous system, a system of total control for a tiny minority rule, minority domination, institutionalized segregation. An even smaller proportion of the population is Indian. Let me open the door for my cat. What's up, bud? So domesticated. So this is the racial composition of South Africa. And so you get a sense that race is an important social cleavage, not just because of the actual demographics of the place, but because of the legacy of apartheid and the consequences of that system of white supremacy and white rule. And so race has been a factor in all elections since 1994. This is a picture of the first all race elections that year. And that election is infamous for these long lines of Black Africans lined up to vote for the first time in a system that had long excluded them and subordinated them as second class, despite constituting an overwhelming majority of the population. But these persistent divisions along racial lines have also corresponded with political divisions along party lines and in divisions in voting behavior as well. And in all elections since 1994, race has overwhelmingly predicted the vote in the behavior of individual South Africans and the way they voted on polling day. And this is the case for most of the electorate. These are some of the reasons that South Africa is a useful place to study race in voting behavior, because of these patterns and the persistence of the divisions. Now, to be clear, we're not making any comment or claim about how these divisions impact South African society. Without a doubt, these divisions are harmful, and these divisions undermine democracy and have worked against unifying society in South Africa. We saw some footage on Monday that highlighted some of the views of in particular white South Africans. And so this is extremely harmful. And the United States is another example of a country with deep social crises related to race relations and a lot of the legacies and the consequences of generations and generations of second class status and subordination of Black Americans through Jim Crow and slavery. So these factors, these legacies do matter, in these divisions along racial lines and in voting behavior seem to implicate this history. It becomes a very useful place then to study race in voting behavior and try to understand, well, what is actually happening when race appears to shape the vote. Is it simply that elections are ethnic headcounts, or is there something more complicated going on involving the interplay between parties and voters into the construction of party images and racialized appeals that emanate from the parties in their campaigns to mobilize support and ultimately win democratic elections? This is what we want to try to find out as we investigate the case of South Africa. So a good place to start is to look at some opinion data on views of the exclusivity of different parties. Basically, the question is, is this party a party for Blacks or for whites or for coloreds or for Indians, moreover? essentially, do you associate this party with this group or this group or this group, or is there no association, or are you uncertain? And what you'll notice is that in 1994, among all of those individuals in the sample asked, the ANC, the African National Congress, was overwhelmingly associated with Black Africans, as inclusive of Black Africans, and barely inclusive at all of whites, somewhat inclusive of mixed race South Africans, and inclusive of Indians. But it's overwhelming, the point that comes from this, which is that the ANC is viewed almost exclusively as the Black African party, inclusive to some degree of mixed race South Africans and inclusive of Indians as well. But remember that Indians are a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion of the population. It doesn't make them any less important, but in terms of the overall proportions, the striking contrast between 30% inclusive of whites and 91% inclusive of Africans is telling. It suggests that the ANC is overwhelmingly viewed as the Black Party. And you'll see that these patterns seem to have repeated themselves in subsequent elections up to the present day. The most recent elections in 2019 also showed public opinion data and polling data that revealed similar associations. And I'll show you that in a moment. But similarly, if you take a look at these two parties, the Democratic Alliance, and forgive me, I don't actually recall what the NP and the NNP stand for, but you'll notice that they seem to show the opposite. These parties seem to be associated with whites, more or less, and far less associated with or inclusive of Africans, somewhat inclusive of mixed race individuals, somewhat inclusive or more inclusive of Indians, less so of Indians in the case of this party. But what you see is that the NP and the DA, generally speaking, appear to be viewed as the white party. And so this is the pattern, and these are the associations that you'll notice appear in the descriptions of the South African case. Now, the Democratic Alliance is also the party that mixed race South Africans tend to gravitate towards as well. Now, to be clear, these are general tendencies, and there are important exceptions and scores of them. And it's not to say that everyone in these groups votes for these parties. It's just to establish that the associations and the views of the parties as associated with this group or that group do tend to hold, and there does appear to be a striking difference between the views of the parties and the associations of the parties based on race. Oh, New National Party. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I knew it was something like National Party, but I couldn't remember, so sometimes you want to be careful. But take a look at the most recent data. This is from 2018, right before the elections in 2019. This is Pew Research Center data. They always have sample sizes that are easily large enough to draw useful descriptive inferences. And what this data shows is that by far, the ANC is the most favored party among Black South Africans. And so 73% of Blacks have a favorable view of the African National Congress. Only 27% of whites do. 30% of mixed race individuals do. That seems to be an important drop since 1994, 1999, where although it was a different question in those years, 46% and 41% of respondents viewed the ANC as inclusive of coloreds or the mixed race voters. That seems to be a a distinction. I don't know if we can really say much because it's a different question, but I'm wondering if because the ANC was in power for the entirety of the period between 1994 and the present day, it's been one party rule, if I'm not mistaken. Um, it's possible that maybe mixed race voters have a declining view of the African National Congress if that party has been increasingly viewed as catering primarily to the interests of Black South Africans. But we can't say that much based on this. Let's notice, though, that the Democratic Alliance is overwhelmingly viewed as favorable by whites, whereas Blacks, again, have a disfavorable or an unfavorable view of the Democratic Alliance. These are striking differences. Mixed race individuals, again, largely have a favorable view of the Democratic Alliance. So we see some striking differences between groups in views of parties. And this again seems to reinforce those cleavages and those racial and party cleavages that first appeared in 1994 and have sustained themselves since. The ANC again is largely viewed as the Black South African Party. This doesn't mean that there isn't plenty of white support. There is, and we saw that in the numbers in the previous slides, but the general pattern seems to hold. And in the most recent elections in 2019, this pattern seems to have repeated itself. The race relation issue in South Africa actually seems to have worsened, and the tensions seem to have worsened as well. And much like the United States, race relations are in need of repair. Let's actually go to December 2013, the election just before the most recent election in 2019. And the following was written about mixed race individuals, mixed race voters, or the colored voters, the apartheid term. The first election in South Africa since the death of Nelson Mandela will be held in April 2014. Most people of mixed race in the Western Cape do not intend to vote for Mandela's African National Congress, ANC party. They are instead loyal to the mostly white Democratic Alliance, DA. Many still define themselves as colored, which is an old apartheid label, demonstrating how race still divides politics in the country.
This is the Cape Town you won't find in tourist brochures. There's a distinct group of people here of mixed race, known under the apartheid system as coloured. Many speak highly of Nelson Mandela, but most don't vote for his party, the African National Congress. The Western Cape is the only province not held by the ANC. In 1994, they supported the National Party, which introduced apartheid. More recently, they voted for the Democratic Alliance, a party considered to be predominantly white. Tony Ehrenreich doesn't think that will change at next year's election because these people were treated better under apartheid than blacks and so feel loyal to whites.
They were party to marginalizing and disrespecting blacks who came into the area in pursuit of jobs and other facilities. So in many respects, what happened to colored people is they identified with the Europeans and disassociated themselves from things African.
Some people we spoke to at this market agree that race is an issue, but others say it comes down to who governs better.
It's because people watch TV, read the papers, and they see corruption in the ANC and fraud. And it's the people inside government that do those things.
Just like the ANC has struggled to reverse the legacy of apartheid in other parts of the country, so has the Democratic Alliance in the Western Cape. In some parts of the city, it seems little has changed. There's high unemployment, high crime, drug abuse, and a big gang problem. But it also seems as if the people here have no intention of changing their voting patterns at next year's election. On this side of Table Mountain, the complexities of apartheid are concentrated, and it's clear that to some people, the colour of a person's skin still matters. Tania Page, Al Jazeera, Cape Town, South Africa.
And when we talk about political behavior, part of that is sort of indirect behavior, right? Opinions, views, attitudes. Those opinions, views, and attitudes shape your behavior and your vote on election day. And they may shape also your optimism about the country's institutions, about democracy. Remember, as I mentioned, in South Africa, the African National Congress has ruled the country since the end of apartheid in 1994. It's been one party rule. And so that means, in effect, the quote unquote black party, or the party that is viewed as the black party, has ruled the country. That should inform then the views of the ANC's voters about the country's direction, if those have been the beneficiaries of the ANC's rule. And so what you find is that those South Africans who largely support the ANC, and we know that those are disproportionately Black South Africans, have a far more favorable view of the country's direction with regard to the rights of people to express their views in public, with regard to the chances people have to improve their standard of living, with regard to how fairly the court system treats citizens, with regard to whether they think elected officials take care of and care about ordinary people, and with regard to whether they view politicians as corrupt or not. And so there are divisions and big gulfs between ANC voters and those who align with other parties. And again, we're sort of now using the parties as heuristics for racial differences, since we've established with no uncertainty that the parties do tend to have constituencies that align along or differ along racial lines. Notice that those who have an unfavorable view of the ANC, and we saw that those were largely white South Africans and mixed or colored South Africans, have much lower response rates with regard to their optimism about rights and liberties and chances to improve standard of living. And so political behavior, indirect and direct, is obviously affected by these links between race and politics. And in places like South Africa, the impact is going to be more pronounced, obviously, because of the legacy of apartheid. But countries like the United States, Brazil, to some degree, maybe India. I can't say much about India, so maybe I won't include India. But the United States and Brazil have similar demographics and similar racial divisions. In the United States and South Africa really are the only two countries that appear to have heightened racial tensions. Brazil doesn't appear to have the same degree of racial tensions, and there are some complex political and historical reasons for that. But the United States, at least, is a country whose experience might be informed by that of South Africa when we look at these sorts of public opinion data. In more generally, you could point out that Black South Africans are more optimistic about the country's economic situation, more so than white respondents and colored respondents. Although notice that even in the case of Black respondents, fewer than 50% of respondents said that they're better off compared to 20 years ago, although 28% said there's no change. So interesting to note that maybe there's a lack of optimism or a lack of positive views more generally about the direction of public policy or the direction of democratic politics, even among Blacks, although we did establish that Blacks are more optimistic, relatively speaking, than whites and coloreds. So these are the data that inform this discussion. When we get down to it, the question becomes, well, then what explains the link between race and voting, and what is causing or bringing about racialized voting? Why is it that race is predicting the vote so effectively over and over and over in South Africa? And this is where we'll begin to incorporate the reading that I assigned for this week, the Ferry reading. That piece outlines three hypotheses on the link between race and voting, or three hypotheses to explain racialized voting, if you will. The first one is an expressive hypothesis that says that ethnic or racialized voting is really an act of identity expression. These individuals voting along racial lines are expressing their identity and their group association when they go to the polls and vote for the Black Party or the White Party or the Colored Party, if this is what we'll use to refer to these associations for convenience's sake. The second hypothesis is a politics as usual hypothesis, which says that ethnic voting really results from policy preferences and performance evaluation. So it's not necessarily that, you know, voters are expressing their racial identity. They're actually voting positively in affirming in rewarding those politicians and parties who have most effectively represented them or governed effectively. And so the video I showed you sort of highlighted that strand of thinking where the woman said, you know, it's about who governs best. It's not about, you know, race, although in this case, race and governing effectively appear to align, suggesting that maybe voters are apt to positively evaluate a party or a candidate more so if they're also of the same race or of the same group. And so these are interesting questions about the precise links between race and voting in the role of parties. The third hypothesis does begin to incorporate parties, and it says that voters use race as a cognitive shortcut during elections. So they're basically using it as a heuristic, as a way to vote. And this is an important hypothesis because it incorporates or suggests a role for political parties who might respond to this tendency of voters to use race as a heuristic by emphasizing or dwelling on race. And so in the video I showed you on Monday, remember that the ANC and the EFP, or the EFP in particular, had gone so far as to call for the nationalization and racialization of key state industries and a role in distributing control and ownership of industries along racial lines. This is so obviously an example of a party using or deploying a racial heuristic or a cognitive shortcut that they hope voters will use to vote for them and put them in power. So I want to incorporate you and hear from you. Based on your reading of the article and your understanding of the findings, what mix of these explains voting in South African elections? After we've talked about all this, all these patterns, all of this role for race and the links between race and voting, what mix of these does the most work in determining the vote in South African elections? Let's start this way. Which hypothesis can we rule out for starters?
I think despite what we saw in the video of that one person saying it, I don't think politics as usual hypothesis explains it, as I think was stated in the free reading as well.
So now this is interesting, right? Because it's really a difference between well, I'm voting because of my race, or I'm voting because of the performance of this party or this candidate. That's a pretty important difference, right? So it may be that those are mutually exclusive and incompatible, and we've got to arbitrate between them. Ishan says maybe despite what we saw in the video, there's less of a role for politics as usual. Maybe we can begin to rule that out. Kevin says, would it be two? Kevin suggests that maybe there is a role for two. Ernie says, politics as usual, I believe. Kyrie says, I think the racial heuristic hypothesis should be dismissed. Ernie says, because we notice that votes in South Africa seems to come down to race most of the time. So remember that these are explanations of why racialized voting seems to be the main form of voting. So this begins with the premise that there's a high rate of racialized voting, or voting along racial lines. Then they ask, well, why is it that that's the case? Why is it that race seems to predict voting behavior so substantially in South Africa? So what the article finds, what Ferry finds, is, first of all, racialized voting is not identity expression. It's not an expression of identity. There's little evidence that what voters are doing is they're expressing their belonging to a group. It's more sophisticated than that. It's not an ethnic head count, so to speak. What's really happening is there's much more of a dynamic between parties and voters, where parties deploy and use racialized appeals, and voters respond to these sorts of heuristics or cognitive shortcuts and respond favorably to racialized appeals. But alongside these racialized appeals and these heuristics, there's also a role for evaluations of candidates and parties, in evaluations based on policy preferences. But remember that those evaluations themselves are often informed by the voter's experience with that party, right? So if the ANC has been in power since 1994 and is viewed primarily as the Black Party and has won elections because of Black voters, it's primarily going to, or it's going to, at least at a bare minimum, it's going to probably respond to and represent and act in the interest of those Black voters. And so their evaluations in the first place are probably going to be informed by their experience with and the benefit that they've accrued from supporting that party. And so this goes back to that original question. You know, are voters more ethnic, or are they more transactional? And is this ethnic and racial voting, or is this transactional and clientelistic voting? It's not strictly clientelistic, because we know that that's private goods distributed within constituencies. What I mean is it more ethnic, or is it more transactional? Are these voters who are Black and who are voting for in winning elections for the ANC, are they doing so because they're receiving benefits from and being represented well by the ANC, and because they feel as though their survival and their benefits depend on the ANC's survival? Or is this something that's more about that cognitive shortcut? This is why ultimately I'm not satisfied with the article, because I don't know if these evaluations can be separated from the racial heuristic in the first place. It's all ethnic voting, right? We can conclude that, and we can conclude that parties play an important role through the deployment of racialized appeals. We saw that in the video. We saw that in how parties have responded to racial tensions recently and in recent elections. The question then is a good one. What the article ultimately suggests is that ethnic voting does, or racialized voting does result from policy preferences or evaluations, but that voters are also using race as a cognitive shortcut during elections in response in part to parties who themselves are deploying racialized appeals in an effort to trigger these cognitive connections and shortcuts in the heads of voters. And so ultimately, the article doesn't allow us to really maybe distinguish between the ethnic and transactional perspectives that I highlighted in that question. And maybe we're not totally satisfied, but at a bare minimum, what we can say is that it's not an ethnic headcount. It's more complicated than that. It has more to do with the dynamic between parties and voters, and how that it informs the vote choice. Identity does matter, but only to the extent that identity might have drawn Black voters to the ANC in the first place. But at that point, a transactional relationship became essential to the ANC retaining the support of Black voters. And so it's politics, baby. This is how it works. Parties win power and retain power and win elections by representing voters. And I have to say, in the case of the United States, this is one reason that the Republican Party is better at politics than the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party seems to hate their voters. The Republican Party seems to fear their voters. In general, the ANC is an example of obviously a strong allegiance and base that seems to cut along racial lines. In the end, it's difficult for us to say much more than that elections are more than just ethnic headcounts. Now, at this point, I did intend to incorporate you, and I know that it's difficult for us to ever have much of a discussion in just a few minutes. I thought that the most important thing for us today was to see the case of South Africa and to try to understand the complexity of the links between race and voting behavior, and to understand that it is more than an ethnic headcount, so to speak. I think the more general questions that come from this case study are as follows. How can South African politics inform the US experience? What will it take to bridge the racial divide in politics? If that divide does exist, and if it does inform voting behavior, what will it take to bridge that? If that divide is what is helping to reinforce racial tensions and racial divides in society. What ultimately is the link between race and voting behavior? Do parties play a role that is as important as it is in South Africa, in the United States, in Brazil, in other cases with similar demographics? What is that link? How important are parties? Is voting a matter of an ethnic headcount in other countries? Is South Africa unique? It's difficult for us to draw those inferences based on this study. And so we'd want to know about, say, race and voting in the US or Brazil. And then finally, maybe a question that helps us to engage and bring this perspective into conversation with the other ones from the class. Do these models suggest that voting behavior is relatively fluid or relatively unchanging? If race and ethnicity are the key predictors of voting behavior one way or another, either because parties shape that relationship or because voters vote on the basis of that characteristic, does that suggest that voting behavior is going to be relatively fluid or relatively unchanging? At this point, everybody, we're out of time, and I have to let you go because you probably have other engagements. But thanks so much for being here. Remember that I have office hours and that we have the exam on Friday. Best of luck as you prepare. reach out to me if you've got questions. Come see me if you want some help. But otherwise, good luck. And I guess I'll speak to you and see you on the other side.